The second volume of the Scott Pilgrim series is a strange beast. The first volume set up this fantastical world and delivered an exciting fight to close the volume. One could reasonably expect the second volume to follow a similar formula, but for the most part, it focuses on the mundane details of Scott and Ramona's lives. And the Evil X fight towards the middle of the novel is an anticlimax. Knives and Ramona's fight in the library serves as the action set piece of the novel, but the clincher is actually the rising action leading into the third volume. I found this skewed direction very refreshing personally, especially on my first read. What helps make the mundane details interesting, in addition to the increasingly better dialogue and humor, is the way O'Malley handles time and motion in his use of panel composition, as well as the use of negative space to depict emotional distress. My understanding of how sequential art panels operate comes from intuition, Western convention, and Scott McCloud's detailed exploration of comics as a medium, Understanding Comics. Most of this essay will be a summary of notable examples of how O'Malley uses panel composition in a creative fashion. To borrow from McCloud, panels are the most essential icons for comics. They represent time and space being divided. Sometimes panel composition can give us certain sensations, while others can represent abstract ideas. One of the most noticeable and creative panel compositions comes early in the book in Chapter 7. Scott and Wallace have an argument on a bus about Scott's two-timing, and when Wallace gets off of the bus, he tells Scott not to come back to their shared abode that night. Scott promptly insults Wallace as the bus drives onward. The increasing physical gap between Wallace and Scott, as Scott keeps yelling at him, is represented by increasingly smaller panels of the bus driving off, with increasingly smaller text bubbles too. This represents both time progression, distance, and even a gradual increase in the pettiness of Scott's retorts by associating them with perspective and relative size. It's a memorable sight gag that gets recycled in a future volume. The general concept is seen again when Scott breaks up with Knives. Negative space is also used quite well on these much larger panels to indicate the crushing weight of emotional angst and the awkward silence. Unlike the scene on the bus exterior, the panel space is divided by either 1/3 of the page or 1/4 of the page for each one. The characters themselves are pushed further and further away. What does this distinction communicate to us? Once again, it indicates a growing rift of distance between the characters, but this time it's different. It isn't taking place in physical space. Instead, it is a figurative rift. Knives is being separated from her fantasies, and Scott is addressing his guilt, even if he hasn't made peace with it yet. The fact that the characters are surrounded by negative space instead of their natural surroundings also helps communicate this figurative language, as I don't think it would have delivered otherwise. Scott gets on a bus again, and here we get another 2-page bit where Scott comes to terms about his guilt over dumping Knives, basically by finding something happy to think about in Ramona. He hasn't quite learned to accept that it's mostly due to his failings that this happened to begin with, but he's making some progress. The first page features Scott getting on the bus and fidgeting around. A disappointed Knives appears in the center surrounded by darkness. The second page features Scott slowly smiling, relaxing, and getting off the bus. Ramona's in the center of this one too, uncharacteristically serene. I thought that this scene was done rather badly on film, where these panels progress along a straight line and panels in front of the static viewing screen. It's done a bit more cleverly in the comic, and I'll explain why. To demonstrate how this scene in the novel is rather clever, I'll refer to Scott McCloud once again. He covers panel-to-panel transitions in order to explain closure, or what our mind fills in between the panels. Most of the panel transitions in Scott Pilgrim are subject to subject, as in, they focus on one active agent doing something to another active agent doing something, or they are action to action, a single active agent performing an action in successive steps from panel to panel. This particular scene features non-sequitur panel transitions to characters that are not physically present. If these depictions of Knives and Ramona were presented in their own panel, in the context of a scene with background imagery and everything, we could easily think that they were just somewhere outside of the bus at the same time, in a different location. But due to certain visual signs, we don't think that. For one, the negative space removes them from the context of the real world. Also, notice how the black space around them isn't really its own panel. One is implied, but really, the only panels are the ones that depict Scott on the bus. The images of Knives and Ramona exist outside of these demarcations for space and time, and thus they can easily appear as abstract concepts. These can be taken as the thoughts of Scott himself, or anything else really, due to this composition. To bring up panel transitions again, there's one that stuck out to me where Scott goes to band practice for a small little scene that forecasts events in Volume 3, namely because the moon has 2 holes in it. This little sequence features scene-to-scene transitions. Scott goes from a bad training session with Wallace, to walking down the street, to practicing with Sex Bomb, to relaxing at Stephen Still's place after the practice. This mostly stood out to me because I didn't see it much in the story's primary narrative, and I could mention it while bringing back up Scott McCloud's terminology. The other types of transitions are moment to moment and aspect to aspect. There are some examples in this book, but they aren't hugely relevant. Another neat example of composition comes up when, hey, you guessed it, the characters are on a bus. Scott and Ramona are talking in a few uniform panels, but above them is a panel of trees with an expanse of sky in between them, much like the view anyone would get while looking upward while driving on a standard roadway. The sequence doesn't have much to do with anything and bridges the gap between the foreshadowing scenes that I mentioned earlier and a scene where Wallace deals with an obsessive Knives at his apartment. Plot-wise, I suppose it explains why Scott isn't at home in that scene, but the fact that most of the page is taken up by an unrelated shot kind of drives home how trivial the scene really is, but it does build some character. You know, most of the volume is like this, as I've said before. Perhaps due to the anticlimactic boss fight, the second volume doesn't have a falling action arc. Instead, there's a rising action leading towards the third volume, and the introduction of the third Evil X, Todd, the only one outside of Gideon who is genuinely presented as a threat. The kickoff to this rising action arc is the content of Envy's phone call to Scott, as well as how it's presented visually. After a page showing off Scott's shock, 6 pages of taut panels with a wild mix of transitions follow as Scott and Envy have a disjointed conversation. The constant element of all of these pages is that they are divided into 9 panels with plenty of extra gutter space at the bottom to make things extra tight. Everything about the panel transitions is wildly inconsistent, and this adds to the controlled frenzy of the scene. The first page has moment-to-moment and aspect-to-aspect shots of Scott looking around confused, a panel of dark space, and a non-sequitur transition to an old photo of Scott and Envy as a couple. None of the panels reveal the full subject. The second page fills in the blanks further with a full shot of Scott divided by panels, with 2 panels depicting other partial photos of the old couple. The third page's panels cut up Scott further with the divisions. Sometimes they're congruent and sometimes they aren't. More of the same follows until the phone goes click. The tension breaks with long shots of Wallace returning home and finding Scott devastated. He responds with some levity, but then calls attention to how dire the situation is for Scott. It's a well-done setup for the extra objective and rising action of the novel. The novel ends on more aspect-to-aspect shots as both Envy and Todd are revealed as the villains for the next novel, indicating that the lackadaisical tone of this volume will not be repeated in the next one. Now that you have your toe dipped in the water of this language of comics, reading Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics can cultivate that. So, go buy his book, read it, understand it. It'll make everyone really happy.